There is something most people do not fully understand about reputation until it is too late. They think of it as a reflection, a passive thing, something that forms naturally in the background of a life well lived, a byproduct of good work, good character, and consistent effort. They believe that if they simply do the right things, reputation will take care of itself, that it will grow quietly, organically, without needing to be tended or protected or thought about with any particular deliberateness. And that belief, more than almost any other, has left brilliant and capable people completely exposed at the exact moment it mattered most. Robert Greene's fifth law is not about vanity. It is not about ego or image management in the shallow modern sense of the phrase. It is about understanding something fundamental, about how power actually moves through the world. Reputation, Greene argues, is not a reflection of who you are. It is the foundation upon which everything else you build either stands or collapses. Think about what reputation actually does in practical terms. Before you walk into a room, your reputation has already arrived. It has spoken on your behalf. It has shaped the way people lean when they first see you, toward you or away from you, with openness or with caution. It determines whether your words are received as insight or dismissed as noise. It decides whether your silence reads as confidence or as weakness. Every interaction you have is filtered through the lens of what people already believe about you. This means that reputation is not just influence. It is infrastructure. It is the invisible architecture beneath every negotiation, every relationship, every opportunity that does or does not find its way to you. And like all infrastructure, it is most noticeable not when it is working, but when it has been damaged. Greene draws a sharp distinction between two ways reputation can be constructed. The first is passive, letting it form through accumulated impressions, unmanaged and unguarded. The second is deliberate, understanding the specific qualities you want associated with your name, and working with patience and consistency to embed them so deeply that they become inseparable from how the world perceives you. The most powerful people in history, he argues, did not leave this to chance. One of the most instructive examples Greene offers is that of P.T. Barnum, the 19th century showman who built an entire empire, not on a single talent, but on the deliberate and relentless cultivation of a reputation for spectacle. Barnum understood before almost anyone else in his era that attention was currency, that what people believed about you before they walked through your door determined whether they walked through it at all. He manufactured stories. He courted controversy. He understood that a reputation for the extraordinary, even when the reality was more complicated, was worth more than any single performance he could ever stage. His name became the show before the curtain ever rose. But Greene's more sobering lesson comes from the other side of this principle. Because if reputation can be built deliberately, it can also be destroyed, and the destruction almost always comes faster than the construction. A single public failure, a single act of perceived dishonesty, a single moment where the gap between your reputation and your reality becomes visible. These things do not just damage your standing. They reframe everything that came before them. Suddenly, past successes are reinterpreted. Former allies begin to quietly recalculate. The goodwill you spent years accumulating evaporates with a speed that feels almost incomprehensible until you have witnessed it firsthand. This is why Greene uses language that sounds almost extreme when he names this law. Guard it with your life. Not guard it carefully, not guard it wisely. With your life, because in the architecture of power, your reputation is your life, professionally, strategically, and in terms of what becomes possible for you. Once it is gone, the work required to rebuild it is not twice the work of building it the first time. It is 10 times the work. And some reputations, once broken in the right way at the wrong moment, never fully recover. There is a particular kind of attack Greene warns about with special emphasis. The reputational attack. The deliberate, calculated effort by an opponent to introduce doubt about your character, your competence, or your integrity into the minds of those whose opinion matters. This kind of attack does not need to be true to be effective. It simply needs to be planted early enough and repeated often enough to take root. The defense against it is not argument. Arguing against a reputational attack draws attention to it, dignifies it, and keeps it alive in the public conversation. The defense is a reputation so well established, so consistently reinforced, that the attack has no soil to grow in. What this law ultimately asks of you is a shift in how you think about your daily choices. Every action you take, every word you speak in a professional context, every commitment you make or fail to keep, these are not isolated events. They are deposits or withdrawals from a single account that you carry with you everywhere you go. The most powerful people understand this not as a burden, but as a discipline. They move through the world with an awareness of the story their name tells, and they tend that story the way a careful architect tends a building. They intend to last for generations. Your reputation will outlive any single achievement. It will outlast any single failure. It will be the thing that either opens the world to you or quietly and visibly closes it. Build it with intention. Protect it with everything you have. And never, not for a moment of convenience, not for a short-term gain, not for the satisfaction of a single unguarded reaction, let it slip from your hands, because what people believe about you is, in the world of power, more real than the truth itself. There is a kind of person most of us have encountered at some point in our lives. They are not necessarily the most talented person in the room. They are not always the most qualified, the most experienced, or the most technically accomplished. But the moment they walk in, something shifts. Eyes move in their direction. Conversations pause. The air in the room reorganizes itself around their presence, and opportunities, the kind that others work years to manufacture, seem to find them effortlessly, naturally, as though the universe has simply decided to arrange itself in their favor. Most people look at someone like that and attribute it to charisma, to luck, to some ineffable quality of personality that cannot be taught or learned or deliberately cultivated. But Robert Greene sees it differently, and his sixth law is one of the most liberating and most misunderstood principles in the entire book. Attention, Greene argues, is not a vanity. It is not something that only the shallow or the self-obsessed should concern themselves with. Attention is power. In a world crowded with noise, with competing voices and competing agendas, the ability to draw eyes and hold them is one of the most consequential skills a person can develop. Because here is the uncomfortable truth that most modest, hard-working, genuinely talented people never fully accept. If no one is watching, it does not matter. The best work in the world, produced in complete obscurity, changes nothing. The most original idea never heard influences no one. The most capable person, consistently overlooked, gets passed over again and again by someone less capable who simply understood how to be seen. Greene is not asking you to be superficial. He is asking you to be strategic, to understand that visibility and merit are not the same thing, but that in the real world, visibility is often what determines which merits get rewarded. He draws one of his most vivid illustrations from the life of Pablo Picasso. By the time Picasso had established himself, he was not simply a painter, he was a phenomenon. He understood instinctively that art alone was not enough. The story around the art, the mystique of the artist, the carefully cultivated sense of controversy and unpredictability, these were not distractions from his work. They were extensions of it. They made the work more visible, more discussed, more valuable. Picasso created attention the way he created paintings, with deliberate, conscious intention, but Greene's more instructive example comes from a less celebrated figure, a 16th-century Venetian courtesan named Veronica Franco, who rose from a world with almost no structural power and became one of the most celebrated and influential figures in her city. She did this not through inherited status or political connection, but through the deliberate cultivation of an identity so compelling, so distinct, so impossible to ignore, that the most powerful men in Venice competed for her attention rather than the other way around. She understood something that most people in far more privileged positions never learn, that in the economy of attention, the person who makes themselves interesting holds more power than the person who simply makes themselves useful. There is a shadow side to this law that Greene addresses with equal seriousness, because attention, once courted, must be managed. The wrong kind of attention, the kind that invites envy, that threatens those above you, that makes you a target before you are protected enough to absorb the blow, can be as dangerous as invisibility. The skill, Greene argues, is not simply in attracting attention. It is in attracting the right kind, in creating a presence that generates admiration, curiosity, and desire rather than resentment and fear. This requires an understanding of your audience, of what they find compelling, of what creates mystique in their specific eyes. The most effective operators in history were not just visible. They were visible in ways that served their larger strategy. Every public gesture, every carefully placed story, every deliberate act of theater was chosen not for its own sake, but for what it built in the minds of the people who mattered. This law asks something of the part of you that was taught to be humble, that was told that good work speaks for itself, that was raised to believe that seeking attention is somehow beneath a person of real substance, and Greene's answer to that is quiet but firm. Humility is a virtue in the right context, but invisible humility serves no one. Not you, not the people your work could reach, not the causes you care about or the impact you want to create. The world does not reward what it cannot see, and a life spent waiting to be discovered is, more often than not, a life spent waiting. There is a version of you that is fully capable, fully prepared, and completely unseen. and there is a version of you that takes everything you already have and makes it visible, deliberately, strategically, with the understanding that being seen is not a compromise of your integrity. It is a decision to let your work actually matter, court attention, not desperately, not recklessly, but with the calm confidence of someone who understands that the world only responds to what it can see, because the most talented person in the room, if they remain invisible, will always lose to the most visible person in the room, and you have worked too hard and come too far to let that be your story. There is a conversation that happens in almost every workplace, in almost every creative environment, in almost every ambitious circle of people who are building something together. Someone does the work, quietly, diligently, thoroughly. They research, they execute, they solve the problems that no one else wanted to touch. And then, at the moment when that work is presented, when it moves from the desk into the room where decisions are made and impressions are formed, someone else is standing at the front, and the person who did the work watches from the back. If you have ever been the person at the back, you know the particular frustration of that moment. And if you have ever been the person at the front, you understand, perhaps more than you would like to admit, exactly how that dynamic works and why it persists. Robert Greene does not moralize about it. He explains it. Law 7 is one of the most provocative in the entire book, not because it is complicated, but because it strips away the comfortable fiction that effort and recognition are naturally connected. They are not. They never have been. And the sooner you understand the difference between doing work and owning work, the sooner you begin to understand how power actually accumulates at the top of any structure. Greene's argument is precise. The world judges by results and by appearances. It does not have the time, the access, or often the interest to trace the full lineage of how something came to be. What it sees is who is standing in front of it, who is presenting the idea, who is putting their name on the outcome. And that person, regardless of how much or how little they personally contributed, becomes associated in the public mind with everything the work represents. This is not an accident. It is a feature of how human perception operates. We attach credit to visibility. We assign ownership to presence. And the people who understand this use it. Greene reaches back to one of the most dramatic examples in scientific history. Isaac Newton, widely regarded as one of the greatest minds who ever lived, was also a ferocious accumulator of intellectual credit. He built upon the work of those before him, Galileo, Kepler, Hooke, absorbing their discoveries, advancing them, and presenting the synthesis under his own name with a confidence that brooked no serious challenge. His famous remark about standing on the shoulders of giants was, in Greene's reading, less an act of humility and more a masterful piece of framing. He acknowledged the past broadly enough to appear gracious, while ensuring that the specific credit for what mattered most remained entirely his own. But the more instructive figure Greene points to is Thomas Edison. Edison was not always the most original inventor in his laboratory. He employed brilliant, technically gifted people, Nikola Tesla among them, whose contributions to the work that bore Edison's name were profound, and in some cases foundational. What Edison possessed that many of those individuals did not was an extraordinary understanding of how to position himself as the author of a vision, He created a structure in which talent flowed toward him, and credit flowed outward from him. He was the name, the brand, the face of an enterprise that many hands had built. Whether one finds this admirable or troubling is almost beside the point. The pattern it represents is one of the most consistent patterns in the history of power. Now, here is the dimension of this law that most readers miss entirely, because Greene is not simply describing a tactic for stealing recognition. He is pointing at something deeper about the nature of leverage. The most powerful position in any system is not the position that does the most work. It is the position that controls the most work. The architect does not lay every brick. The conductor does not play every instrument. The general does not fight every battle. What they do, what makes their position powerful, is that they hold the vision, they direct the energy. This is the legitimate heart of Law 7. Not exploitation, but orchestration. The person who can consistently, results were assembled, There is an honest challenge embedded in this law that deserves to be named directly. The line between strategic credit-taking and genuine exploitation is real, and Greene acknowledges it, even as he describes the mechanics unflinchingly. The most sustainable version of this law is not one built on erasure, on taking everything and leaving those who contributed with nothing. History is full of powerful people who operated that way, and many of them eventually found that the talent stopped flowing in their direction. The most durable version is built on a different understanding, that your role is to elevate the work, to give it a stage it could not have found on its own, and that the people whose contributions you channel are, in the best version of this dynamic, lifted by their proximity to the platform you have built, even as you remain the name most closely associated with what it produces. Credit is not just recognition. It is momentum. It is the accumulation of a track record that opens doors, attracts resources, and compounds over time into something that cannot easily be dismantled. Understand who does the work. Understand how credit moves. And position yourself not just as someone who contributes, but as someone who leads, shapes, and ultimately owns the outcome. Because in the final accounting of power, the world remembers the name on the door, not the names of everyone who helped build what is behind it. There is a particular kind of power that most people never think to pursue, not the power of force, not the power of persuasion, not even the power of reputation, as important as that is. There is a quieter, more structural kind of power, one that operates before a single word is spoken, before a single negotiation begins, before the other person has even fully realized what is happening. It is the power of position, of having arranged the situation so completely in your favor that by the time anyone else arrives at the table, the terms have already been set, the ground has already been chosen, and the person who chose it is you. This is the essence of Robert Greene's 8th law, and it is, in many ways, one of the most elegant principles in the entire book. We live in a world that celebrates pursuit, that romanticizes the image of the ambitious person who goes out and gets what they want, who moves aggressively, who pushes doors open, who closes the distance between themselves and their goal through sheer force of will. There is something genuinely admirable about that energy. But Greene asks you to look more carefully at the mechanics of power and notice something that the mythology of pursuit tends to obscure. The person who is always moving toward is always, in some sense, in a weaker position than the person who is making others move toward them. Think about what it means to go to someone, to travel to their location, their terms, their chosen environment. The moment you do that, you have already made a concession. You have communicated, before a single word has been exchanged, that they hold something you want badly enough to come for it. And that information, that visible desire, that demonstrated need, shifts the balance of every interaction that follows. Now reverse it. Imagine being the person that others come to. Imagine that your position, your reputation, your carefully constructed presence is magnetic enough that people arrange themselves around you rather than the other way around. The negotiation that happens in that context is a fundamentally different conversation. The power dynamics in that room are arranged differently before anyone has said a word. Greene reaches into military history for one of his most compelling illustrations. Napoleon Bonaparte, despite his reputation for aggressive and relentless offensive warfare, was in his greatest campaigns a master of reactive strategy. He understood that the general who chooses the battlefield chooses the outcome. He would frequently maneuver his forces in ways designed not to attack directly, but to draw the enemy into terrain of his own choosing, to make them come to him on ground he had already studied, in conditions he had already prepared for. The enemy, convinced they were the aggressors, would advance only to find that they had walked into an architecture of defeat that had been quietly assembled before they arrived. This is the military expression of law. 8. But its applications extend far beyond warfare. In negotiation, the principle is equally decisive. The most powerful negotiators in any field, whether in business, diplomacy, or personal relationships, share a consistent quality. They are never in a hurry. They project an abundance of alternatives. They make it quietly, unmistakably clear that the deal they are discussing is desirable, but not necessary, that they could walk away and their world would continue without disruption. This posture, whether it is entirely true or carefully constructed, changes everything. It forces the other party to move toward them, to make concessions, to work harder for the agreement, because the person who needs the deal less holds the terms of the deal more. Greene points to the courts of historical power as laboratories of this principle. The most influential figures at Versailles, at the Vatican, at the courts of Renaissance Italy were rarely the ones who rushed toward the king. They were the ones who created conditions in which the king came to them, who made themselves so valuable, so interesting, so indispensable, that proximity to them was perceived as a prize rather than a courtesy. The second half of this law introduces a concept that Greene names directly and without apology: the use of bait. And it is here that the law becomes most psychologically sophisticated, because the bait Greene describes is not crude manipulation. It is not a trap in the obvious sense. It is something more refined, the strategic understanding of what a specific person wants deeply enough to move toward, and the art of placing that thing in your direction. Every person carries within them a set of desires. Some are conscious. Many are not. There are things people want so consistently, so reliably, that they will reorganize their behavior around the possibility of obtaining them. Recognition, advantage, the feeling of being chosen, the sense of exclusive access to something valuable. The master of Law 8 understands these desires not in the abstract, but in the specific. They know what this particular person, in this particular moment, wants badly enough to pursue, and they position themselves as the source of it. What this law ultimately requires is a fundamental shift in how you think about movement, about who should be reaching and who should be waiting, about the difference between chasing an outcome and engineering the conditions that make the outcome come to you. It requires patience. It requires the confidence to resist the urge to close distance when stillness would serve you better. And it requires the kind of self-possession that can hold a position calmly, without anxiety while the world arranges itself around it. Stop chasing what you want. Build something worth coming to. Create the conditions, the reputation, the presence, and the perceived value that make movement in your direction feel not like your need, but like their opportunity, because the person who is always being pursued holds a kind of power that the person always in pursuit will never fully understand, and in the quiet architecture of lasting influence, it is almost always the one who waits, wisely, deliberately, and on the right ground, who ultimately decides how the game ends.